Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about the pretty contentious and very difficult task of valuing mortality. That is putting a dollar value on human life, or maybe more specifically, putting a dollar value on preventing death. Now, the government is constantly having to make decisions about things that are going to increase or reduce the probability that someone is going to die. So, for example, when the government sets speed limits, a given speed limit is going to correspond to some probability of accidents, which can many times result in death. And the level you set the speed limit at is going to affect the number of accidents that you expect to take place. This would also be the case if the government is trying to decide how much to invest in health research. So this would be things like investing in cures for cancer or heart disease, things that are going to prevent deaths in the overall population. The government would use this kind of information about valuing life when they're making decisions about making these health investments. This would also be the case. The government would also be using information like this when, for example, they're deciding whether or not to close down all non-essential businesses during the outbreak of an infectious disease. So these are all domains where the government, if it wants to make informed decisions on these issues, will have to make some evaluation about what it's worth to society to reduce mortality risk. So reducing mortality risk may be part of what we care about, but it isn't everything we care about. There are cases where it makes sense to enact policies that will reduce the risk of death, but there comes a point where it would be prohibitively costly to avoid all mortality risk. Right, so you could reduce deaths dramatically in the United States just by shutting down all highways, but most people would consider this undesirable, indicating that there's a point where we trade off reductions in mortality risk against other things we care about, like being able to drive on the highway to visit a family out of state. So what makes these policy domains unique, at least the ones that I've outlined and I've written here on this first slide, is that they deal basically with average deaths, or sometimes we call them statistical deaths, where the rate of death may be modified by some policy, but we don't know exactly which people's lives are going to be saved by the policy. It just has kind of an average effect on the whole population. There are certain rare cases where the government or the public at large can have a direct effect on saving people's lives. But most of the power that the government has over preventing deaths is in this, quote, statistical domain. Much more frequently, the types of decisions that the government makes are very mundane. They involve things like whether to increase safety requirements at work sites in order to reduce the probability of accidents on the job, or perhaps they're designing highways and roads to prevent accidents, to give drivers maybe more reaction time or more visibility. These are very mundane kinds of policy decisions, but nevertheless, the government is going to be constantly having to make calls over how it spends its resources for things that are going to affect mortality. And that's why this issue of valuing mortality or valuing mortality risk is especially important. So one crude way to measure the value of a death would be simply to calculate the present value of all future earnings that a person would lose if they were no longer alive. Essentially, this would represent the extra production that society would miss out on because this person is no longer able to sell his or her goods and services into the market. And of course, even though this is a little bit callous, it does make some sense insofar as when we're selling our services or our goods into the market, we are providing value for other people in society. We're producing something, we are producing value, we're producing things that benefit other people's lives. And so that's one reason why this measure does capture maybe some of what we care about when we're valuing life. There is one version of this measure that actually takes earnings and subtracts off consumption in order to account for what the person gives to society net of what they take. But this approach actually misses the fact that the person himself or herself is part of society, and so the things that this person consumes ought to be classified as benefits to society as a whole because this person is within society. Now, this foregone earnings method, this metric, does embody a rather strict assumption that your earnings are identical to your social product. In fact, it's only the value of marketed, specifically the marketed goods and services that are being captured by your income. So any sort of volunteer work that you're doing or any other kind of non-monetary service that you're doing, any other kind of value that you produce as you live within your community and help strengthen and encourage and mentor others, any kind of home production that you take part in, raising kids, having a friend over and cooking them a meal, those don't have actual wages or income associated with them. And so if your measure ignores those activities, you're going to miss out on a lot of the non-monetary value that people create. So that's one of the first problems with this method. It's also going to implicitly weight more heavily the lives of people that make more money, and it's also going to weight them, and it's also going to weight more heavily younger people because they have more time left in their life to earn, so they would have a higher present value of all their future earnings, and that would result in them having a higher value placed in their life according to this foregone earnings measure. So that's one way to do it, just measuring how much less income this person is going to be earning over the course of their life. But rather than this production approach, we might actually consider the problem more directly and take account of what it is that people would be willing to pay or actually are willing to pay to reduce their own risk of death. And you can do this by looking at how people make purchase decisions or choose jobs that have a direct influence on their likelihood of death. This is a little bit more of a direct way to get at the question of how to evaluate a policy that's going to reduce mortality risk in the population as a whole. You can base it off of what individuals themselves are willing to pay to reduce their own risk of death. One thing that makes this tricky is that things that just generally improve safety reduce the overall mortality rate, but the individuals that are saved aren't individual people that we can identify in advance. We don't know exactly who it is, who it's going to be that's going to, whose life is going to be saved by a particular policy. So that's kind of why this is sort of a value of life in a statistical sense. In some cases, you can tell after the fact whose life has been saved if you have a car accident and the airbag goes off and the person is, the impact is cushioned by the airbag and their life is saved from that. You can tell after the fact what's happened to them, and you can identify that their life has been saved. In other things like just reducing the amount of particulate matter in the air, which is going to slightly reduce the amount of respiratory ailments that people suffer from, that kind of thing, it might be very hard to know, exactly how much the policy contributed to the saved life of even any one particular person. Okay, so let's consider how this might actually be done in practice, this valuing statistical life. We can use evidence from consumer purchases to try to get a handle on what people are willing to pay to reduce the risk of their own death or reduce the risk of a family member's death. We can consider the case of, say, a parent purchasing a bike helmet for a child. So this is going to be a bit of a contrived example, but it's actually not completely contrived. There's a long document from the OECD that gives a summary of a lot of the concepts for conducting benefit cost analysis. And they cite a study from 2001 that actually looked at this problem of parents purchasing bike helmets for their kids and what that implies about their willingness to pay for reducing mortality risk. So these numbers come from that. I'll post a section of that of that report that just discusses this individual case, but that's where I'm getting these numbers from here for this bike helmet purchase example. So let's say the annualized cost of a bike helmet is $6.50. That's the annual cost. So the bike helmet's more than that, but you expect it to be able to last a little bit longer. It's going to be durable. It's going to last a number of years, and so over the period of the lifetime of the bike helmet, it's about $6.50. And let's suppose that about 32 children between age 5 and 9 are going to die each year from head injuries while biking. And the population of these bicycle riding 5 to 9-year-olds is about 14.3 million. And just for the sake of this example, let's assume that purchasing a helmet and then using the helmet is going to effectively prevent what would have otherwise been a fatal injury, the fatal head injury. And so these will prevent these 32 deaths among the 14.3 million bicycle riders among 5 to 9-year-olds. The way we can analyze this and actually back out the value of a statistical life from this example is to use a decision tree, which we're familiar with from this class. So just as with all decision trees, we start out with a decision to be made. This is the square decision node. And our choice is whether to buy the helmet. That's going to cost $6.50. The other option is not to buy the bike helmet. And then from there, we have some probability of getting in a fatal accident or not. We're going to say the probability of a fatal accident is going to be P. The probability of not having a fatal accident is going to be 1 minus P. Now with this helmet, our life is going to be saved in the event of a fatal accident. So in this case, we live. If we get in a fatal accident and we get the value of being alive, the payoff to being alive. If we don't get in a fatal accident, we also live, and we get the payoff to being alive. I'm going to call that payoff to being alive V. If we don't buy the helmet and we do get in a fatal accident, in this case we die, and so our payoff is 0. If we don't get in a fatal accident without the helmet, we in fact live, and so our payoff is V. So from this decision tree, we see that the payoff to buying a helmet is V minus the cost of the helmet. And in fact, there's no probability associated with this payoff because we live in the case of a fatal accident, and we also live in the case of it not having a fatal accident, so that has no uncertainty actually about whether we're going to live or die. So our payoff is just the V, the payoff to being alive. Now the expected payoff to not buying a helmet, in this case, we don't have any cost, but we do have some probability of getting in a fatal accident, in which case our payoff is 0. That's the scenario in which we get in a fatal accident and die. We'd have a 0 payoff with a P probability. And then we would add that to the probability of not getting in a fatal accident, in which case we would capture the payoff to being alive V. Now the key step in using this information to identifying what people are willing to pay to reduce their mortality risk, or what their implied value on their own life is based on these decisions, the key to this is to assume that in a market, these payoffs have to be basically identical. And you can think of that like if it was the case that the payoff to buying a helmet was vastly greater than the expected payoff to not buying a helmet, then helmet vendors would be able to increase the price of helmets and not decrease at all their sales. People would still be willing to pay much larger amounts for a helmet if it was actually the case that the payoff to buying the helmet was vastly larger than the expected payoff to not buying the helmet. That's kind of the key trick that we're using in this solution procedure here. And so because of the situation of the payoff to buying a helmet being so much greater than the expected payoff to not buying a helmet, because that's unstable and that really can't persist, the price of helmets you'd expect to kind of go up. Vendors would increase their price until the point where people are kind of indifferent. The marginal consumer is a little bit indifferent between forking over the money for the helmet versus not. And so under that assumption, we can equate these payoffs. That's our market equilibrium assumption. We can equate these payoffs. We'll find that, in fact, this cancels out. This becomes V minus PV. This is going to cancel out. This V on the right-hand side is going to cancel out with this V on the left-hand side. And we get that PV equals $6.50. And we can solve for V, which is going to be given by the cost of the helmet, $6.50, divided by P, which is the probability that your life is saved by having the helmet in a fatal accident. So if we go back to our decision tree, if we buy the helmet, we have a P probability of getting in a fatal accident, and instead of dying as we would in the case we don't have a helmet, we actually live and we capture the payoff to being alive V. And this P, this probability of being in a fatal accident, we're going to say that that's going to be equal to this 32 deaths of 5 to 9-year-old children annually divided by the 14.3 million bicycle riders. We can discover that this probability P is equal to 0.000022. So that's the probability that your life is saved by buying the helmet. Now if we plug that into this equation, we can find that this value is approximately 2.9 million. So essentially paying $6.50 per year to reduce your mortality risk by this probability P, to go from P, probability of dying, to 0 probability of dying, that's an implied value of 2.9 million. So that was a case where the purchase of some product guaranteed that you'd be saved in the event of a fatal accident. There's also a way to analyze it so that instead of guaranteeing your life will be saved with this product, you might just actually reduce the rate at which you die, which has the same structure, but it might be good just to formally go through that kind of problem. This one is actually in the textbook on page 342. It goes through this airbag purchase example. So in this case, the cost of an airbag, and I'm actually going to go through this problem just with variables. C for the cost of the product, P for the probability of not dying if you don't have the product, and then omega, and this omega representing the increased probability that you'll survive a car crash if you do have the airbag. So I'm just going to use variables for this just to show the general form of a solution for a problem like this. So again, we can use a decision tree to make this valuation. We have the decision first to get the airbag, or not. In this case, this is a little bit of a contrived example because nowadays airbags come standard on all vehicles, but this, for the sake of this example, let's just imagine that you have maybe the choice of whether to install one upon purchasing your car for an extra fee. Now, just from driving around, you have some baseline probability of surviving and some baseline probability of getting in a fatal accident. But let's say that if you have this airbag, your baseline probability of surviving is P, but if you have the airbag, your probability of surviving is P plus omega. So that's this contingency in which you live. And then the contingency in which you do not live from driving in a car. The probability associated with that is 1 minus p minus omega. The payoffs, again, there's some value that you yourself put on being alive in the future. You get that value v from that, and then if you are not alive, you don't get any of that value. If you don't get the airbag, again, there's still some probability that you live. That would be probability p that you live. And then probability 1 minus p for the alternative. And the payoffs to that would be, again, v in the case that you live and 0 in the case that you do not. And of course, just to be complete, this airbag is going to cost you some money, so there's going to be some cost C, which will be a negative payoff. Your income is reduced by amount C in this top decision where you get the airbag, but that will affect the probability of these outcomes, life and death, later on when you go and drive your car around. Now, once again, we have the same market concept, market equilibrium concept, where if the payoff up here to buying the airbag is so much larger than the payoff down here to not getting it, then airbag vendors would be able to increase their prices dramatically and still sell just as many airbags because people would value that choice by so much more than the alternative. And so you'd expect airbag vendors then to do that until, raise the price of the airbag until you get to the point where people are somewhat indifferent between these two options of getting this extra safety feature, which could reduce your risk of death by a small amount, versus not getting it. And so the expected payoff from the airbag, in this case, that would be the probability of surviving with the airbag, and that's p plus omega. The payoff to surviving is v, and there's some probability of mortality, which is 1 minus this prior probability, and it has some payoff 0. And then you also have to pay C with certainty to get the airbag. You also have an expected payoff without the airbag. And if we remind ourselves what that is, that's this lower branch where we have p probability of living and a 1 minus p probability of dying. So that's the p probability of living times the value that you place on that, the payoff to that, plus the probability of death times that payoff. And then just according to that market equilibrium process that I just described, these two payoffs have to be somewhat similar in an equilibrium. So to solve for v, we can set them equal to one another. I'm going to omit all the terms that are 0. We had a couple terms that are 0 from up here. I'm just going to omit those from these equations. And so if we expand this out, we can see that some of these terms, again, are going to cancel out. And this is just the general form of the value of a statistical life v, where you have C, which is the cost, of this product that's going to provide some additional safety. And we have omega, which is the extra probability of surviving that you get by having that product. The way you can interpret this omega, we can actually look back here at this slide. If you look closely at this text right here, this omega represents the lower fatality rate that you have from having the airbag. So let's say if omega was 0.0001, that would indicate that there's one fewer fatality among all the 10,000 cars that are equipped with airbags. So for every 10,000 cars that are equipped with airbags, there's one fewer automobile fatality. That's what this omega is indicating. And so that omega is the amount that you reduce your risk of death by having that safety feature, in this case, the airbag. So you divide the cost of the safety feature by the amount that you reduce your risk of death, and that gives you this V, this payoff to being alive. In some sense, this is a revealed preference where this is the implied payoff to being alive, which would justify the purchase of this safety feature, which costs C and reduces your probability of staying alive by omega. So we just looked at two examples of consumer purchase decisions which can reduce mortality risk. And so another way to get at this value of a statistical life, VSL, is by looking at the wage differentials that result from occupations that have lower mortality risk. Essentially, this is going to embody exactly the same sort of trade-offs that occurred in the consumer purchase decision, where you're trading some amount of your money for a lower mortality risk. In this case, you're trading money not directly with a consumer purchase, but you're trading your money by perhaps taking a little bit of a lower salary in order to work a little bit of a safer job. We can consider the case of a roofer versus a commercial fisherman. Let's say that a roofer can earn $36,000 a year, and the mortality rate for that occupation is about 5 per 10,000. And then let's say that a commercial fisherman earns $38,000 a year, and that is actually, I think, the most dangerous job you can have is a commercial fisherman. It might be second only to logging, people that work in the logging industry. But we're going to assume that the mortality rate for a commercial fisherman is 8 per 10,000. And so again, we can use a decision tree to analyze this problem. Now I'm going to make an assumption that both of these occupations could be learned by anybody that's just willing to put in the time and willing to, work with their hands. This wouldn't necessarily require any. These are things that people could pick up and learn the skills quite readily, and so it's just a matter of how much mortality risk you're willing to take on. That's kind of a background assumption. If you're going to assume that this wage differential is capturing the willingness to pay for differences in mortality risk. But if we make that assumption, we can set up a decision tree just like we did before, where our choices are to be a roofer and earn $36,000 per year, or to be a fisherman and earn $38,000 a year. The probability of living as a roofer, remember there were 5 deaths per 10,000, so the probability of living is 0.995. The probability of dying is 5 per 10,000, so that's 0.005. There's some payoffs to these two outcomes. And the same thing for being a fisherman, except the probabilities are a little bit different. So the probability of living, remember there are 8 deaths per 10,000 for this occupation, so the probability of living was 0.09992. Probability of dying was 8 per 10,000, that's 0.0008. And if you live, you get your payoff of being alive. If you die, you get 0. All right, so once again, we're going to assume that if the wages that are being paid, or if the salaries that are being paid to these people are way out of line, where it's the case that a commercial fisherman earns the same as a roofer but has a higher mortality risk, then you'd expect nobody to choose the occupation of commercial fishermen when they could earn the same salary and reduce their mortality risk, essentially at no cost to themselves. And so there has to be some parity between the wages between these occupations. And that's going to be the underlying assumption, again, that market equilibrium assumption that we use to back out this value of statistical life. Just as before, we're going to compare the payoffs. We look at the payoffs from being a roofer. That's going to involve our $36,000 salary, plus our value of being alive. And this probability P, this is an annual death rate. So this would be the number of deaths that would occur over the course of a year, say per 10,000 workers. And so you'd be facing this risk every year. And so this is in the same terms as this salary, which is also in terms of years. And you have some probability of dying as a roofer, in which case your payoff is 0. Do the same thing for being a fisherman. You have some expected payoff from being a fisherman, and that's the $38,000 per year that you earn in salary, plus the expected value of being alive. I'm going to use the variable Q to denote the probability of surviving as a fisherman. So you have Q, probability of surviving as a fisherman, times the value of that. Plus the probability of death times the payoff of death. And once again, we're going to assume there's some parity between these trade-offs where the salary of the job is going to come with some mortality risk. And if there's not a nice parity between those values, then you'd expect people just to switch out of one of those jobs, either take a higher salary where there's no more mortality risk, or take a lower salary where there's maybe an extremely less mortality risk. Now that parity comes from the fact that if there is this salary differential, but let's say that there is this salary differential of $2,000, but the risk of dying from being a commercial fisherman is exactly the same as that from roofing, then everybody would be switching from roofing into fishing. Again, I'm assuming that there's an ability for anybody to pick up the necessary skills without too much trouble. Of course, there are very specialized skills, but it's largely a manual labor type job, and a job that requires you to just work very long and difficult hours with physical stuff. And so I'm assuming that a roofer, if they wanted to, would not have too much trouble switching into the career path of being a commercial fisherman. And if it's the case that the salary is $2,000 per year higher, but there's no extra risk of death, you'd expect all the roofers to go switch into that profession. That's essentially free money. You get extra salary and you don't actually put yourself in any more danger. So that's the underlying assumption of this next part, where we equate the expected payoffs from these two jobs. So for roofing, we have the salary plus the probability of surviving times the value of that survivorship. That's going to have to be equal to, in equilibrium, to the salary of being a commercial fisherman plus the probability of surviving being a commercial fisherman. I've just eliminated the terms that are 0 here. And so if we rearrange this equation, we get that P minus Q times V is equal to 2,000. Remember, this P is the probability of surviving as a roofer, and this Q is the probability of surviving as a fisherman. So this is the difference, the extra probability you have of surviving if you are a roofer rather than a fisherman. And this 2,000 is the salary differential. That's the extra money that you're taking on by taking a riskier job, or it's the money that you're giving up by taking a little bit of a safer job. Again, we can solve that. We find that V, the value of statistical life, is equal to $2,000 salary differential divided by the survival rate differential. Which, if we remember from our example, the P, the probability of surviving as a roofer, that was equal to 0.9995. There was a mortality rate of 5 per 10,000, so the survival rate, P, would be 0.9995. There was 8 deaths per 10,000 as a fisherman, and so the survival rate for a fisherman would be 0.992. So we can recall that P minus Q is going to be equal to 0.0003. And if we take the $2,000 wage differential and we divide it by that 0.003, we get an implied value for V of 6.67 million. That's the value on being alive that will be implied by the choice of taking that extra $2,000 salary and also having a little bit higher mortality rate. Now, this is exactly analogous to the consumer purchase case we had before. In this case, the salary differential is like the cost of the good. So if you're roofing, you're taking $2,000 less, and in effect, you're paying $2,000 to get a higher risk of surviving, which is exactly like the C that we looked at for the cost of a safety feature. And then that P minus Q is just like the omega, which represented the extra probability of surviving by having that good. In this case, it's not a good, it's an occupation that comes with a little bit lower mortality rate. Okay, so these are some of the common ways of trying to back out what this value of a statistical life is using consumer purchase studies, as well as what are called wage risk studies, which are doing exactly this analysis of looking at the extra money that people have to be compensated in order to take on extra mortality risk. Those are two common ways of doing it. Now, just some of the shortcomings of these approaches, these consumer purchase study approaches and the wage risk approaches. This is assuming that people have information about the risks, that people know exactly what the extra risks of death are. In fact, there may be cognitive biases which could cause people to put excessive weight on low probability, really bad events. You might overweight that in your mind, and that would be something that would potentially overstate the value of a statistical life. In the other direction, not having a good understanding of what the meaning of the higher fatality risk is, that is not really understanding, what it means for 8 people in 10,000 to die rather than 5. I mean, those are very small numbers, and we don't have direct experience where we have a good intuition for what that actually means for 5 out of 10,000 people to die rather than 8 out of 10,000 people to die. If there's not a good understanding of the meaning of what that extra risk is, people could discount that risk, and then that would actually understate the value of a statistical life. Another problem is that risky jobs are relatively rare. Most jobs are just very safe, and so the wage risk method, if you're trying to look at differential between the salaries of different occupations, individuals are going to be self-selecting into those risky occupations, likely because they're probably already very risk-tolerant individuals. So it's a small group of people that are being analyzed in these wage risk studies, and they're not necessarily a representative group of people among the population because they might be inclined to have a high risk tolerance as it is, given that they would be selecting themselves into those sorts of occupations that have high mortality risk. And so it may not actually capture what a typical person might pay to reduce their mortality risk. It might capture what kind of a very, very robust risk tolerant type of person would be willing to pay. So it might not be representative of the population as a whole's willingness to pay to reduce mortality risk. The third problem, bullet point number 3, is that the job fatality data is aggregated by industry. It doesn't. It takes a little bit more digging to find out what people are actually doing in their occupations. If you just look at industry level data, you'll have secretaries that work in a mining company being grouped together as working in the mining sector along with the coal miners themselves. And if you just look at that industry aggregated data, that might not give you a good sense of what the risks actually are for the specific people that are earning what they are in those jobs. And so you might have to just dig a little deeper and find out what the actual occupations are, rather than looking at just people who are earning a certain amount of money in a particular industry, because that's not necessarily going to capture what they're doing in that sector. They could be working in a very safe job within that sector, and there could be people working in very dangerous jobs inside of a sector that tends overall to have a low mortality rate. So that's just a data problem that just requires you to look a little bit more carefully about what people's occupations actually are, rather than looking at just the industry level statistics. And then this last problem is kind of interesting. We're dealing with very small probabilities here of mortality. This is not most people that are facing these actual deaths. And so that can suffer from this problem where when new data comes in, let's say there's just one extra person dies per 10,000 over the period of a given year. So if there's one more accident and one more person dies out of 10,000 people, then that's going to increase our estimate of what the mortality rate is, and that can actually produce pretty wide swings in the estimate of the value of a statistical life. So if we look back at this wage study, or this case of a roofing versus fishermen, we have five deaths per 10,000 as the death rate for a roofer. Let's say that there's one more accident, and now there's 6 per 10,000. Right, so that would make the probability of dying in the roofing occupation 0.0006. That would make the probability of living P 0.09994. And so if we take that to our calculation over here, we have 0.9994 minus 0.9992. That's going to make this a 0.0002 differential in mortality rate. And if we take 2,000 divided by 0.0002, we actually, instead of 6.67 million, we actually get 10 million. So these mortality rates are very small, and so just having a single extra death can actually produce a pretty wide swing in the estimate of the value of a statistical life, where it can go from 6.67 million to 10 million just by one extra death in the roofing occupation. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as you're looking at that. It is subject to a lot of volatility, and it's subject to the most current data that we have, which, if new data comes in that shows the mortality rate bumps up just by a small amount in one occupation, that can produce a pretty wide swing in the VSL estimate. All right, so this was a description of sort of the process that economists go through to make some estimates of this value of a statistical life. There was the consumer purchase studies, purchases of helmets or airbags, and there's the wage risk studies, which look at the wage differentials that are earned by people that take on a little bit more mortality risk. We also contrasted that with the foregone earnings method, where you're simply adding up the present value of the wages or the income that people would earn over the course of their life if they were to remain alive. Okay, and as I mentioned at the top, the reason we'd be making these estimates is in fact to inform our decisions about, for example, how to set speed limits, how much to spend on health research, and also making the decision about whether it makes sense to close down universities or non-essential businesses during an infectious disease outbreak. These are undoubtedly being some of these numbers about the value of preventing deaths are undoubtedly being used in the current analysis of how much to shut things down and quarantine people and reduce the risk of the spread of the coronavirus. And I want to mention too that the procedures we went through to estimate this VSL, the value of a statistical life, in these consumer purchase cases and the wage risk case, the procedures we went through came up with a single value for that case, but in fact there's not just one value for the value of a statistical life. There's a wide range of estimates, and all kinds of studies have been done to try to get at this, and there's variation in what the values that people come up with are. I'd actually encourage you to go look at the textbook, page 405. This is Boardman, page 405 to 406, has a discussion of some of the actual analyses and meta-analyses of these value of statistical life studies. And you'll find that the values that people come up with have ranged from something on the order of 2.8 million at the low end to somewhere around 8 million at the high end. And of course there can be estimates that are higher than that, but this is where a lot of the values actually lie when people have done these estimations. And this is actually an excellent example of for your projects, when you're thinking about uncertainty, this number, what the value should be on the reduction in mortality risk that might be associated with the policy. What the value should be does have variation, does have uncertainty associated with it, and this is an excellent example of how, having an analysis that considers different values for this, maybe one that chooses 3 million, maybe one that chooses 8 million, and see how that shifts the benefits relative to the costs. Testing that for a range of cases is exactly what you should be doing in your projects, in accounting for the inherent uncertainty, not just for the value of life, but for any sort of parameter or outcome for which the benefit value is somewhat uncertain. Okay, so that's what I've got for the lecture on valuing mortality. Hopefully this was somewhat bearable to watch. I'll be trying to come out with another lecture video sometime later this week, so stay tuned for that.